Morning, my name is Lynn Scarf. I'm Director of the National Museum of Ireland, and it's a huge pleasure to welcome you all here this morning to this one-day conference. I can already see within the room there's great energy and conversations to be had, and we're really excited to hear from people today through the panels and through conversations and questions as the day goes on. Before we begin, I just wanted to take a moment. Many of you will have heard the very sad news that Ailbhe Murphy, a colleague of many of us, passed away this week. And I know that there's many people in the room, certainly her colleagues in Create and many other people who worked with Ailbhe, who are really just coming to terms with that news this week. I had the privilege of working with Ailbhe early on in my career when she was in Breaking Ground in Ballymun, and I was working on a similar project, and we shared similar flats in Shangaan, and she had been there a lot longer than me, and she was just so wonderful and so warm and really taught me an awful lot about this kind of work and this kind of practice. And she's been such a trailblazer. I think she leaves just an incredible legacy. But rather than have a moment's silence, because that didn't feel like the right thing in terms of Ailbhe, I wanted everybody to turn to their left and introduce themselves and have a quick conversation with the person beside them. And if you know them already, just say, "Hi, how are you doing?" I can already see that this is going to be very difficult to stop. Okay, folks, I'm going to try stop you having a conversation. Let me see if I just keep talking for a while. Will everybody else stop? Okay, there we go. Almost. Nearly. Natalie's still talking. Damien's still talking. Yeah, okay, there we go. I see, once you call people out by their name, everybody goes, "Oh God, she's picked me out." So let's focus on that energy that was just in this room for those few minutes and send it out into the universe in memory of Ailbhe. Okay, thank you all. So, a very important day with lots of very interesting people in the room. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our education and learning team for putting this all together, and for Anthony and everybody that's taken part. Today really is about, as we said, it's about bringing people together, artists, curators, educators, activists, to explore the role and the impact of the artist in the museum. This is something that we take very seriously, actually, in the museum. Within our new strategy, we have a particular strand around developing our artist and residency programs. But really for us today, this conference is really a bit about listening and learning and sharing what we want to hear and understand is, what does that look like? How do we shape it? How do we ingrain it into every facet of the museum? How is it right up into the level of the board throughout every individual that works in our organization? What are the values of it? How does the work contribute to the collection? What's the legacy of it? How do we reach out into communities with it? There are just a few questions off the top of my head to get us started, but I think more will emerge, and there's people in this room, I think, who have significant experience and learning in this space that we're really happy to have here. So you're all very welcome. I hope you have a very interesting day. I'm going to be coming back to join you at the end of the day. Unfortunately, this coincided with a number of board committee meetings, so I'm actually heading off to a governance audit and risk committee meeting. I would really rather be in here, let's be honest, but anyway. And I'll come back. I'll be looking forward to come back and join you. But before I go, I have the real pleasure of introducing our first keynote speaker. this morning. So our first keynote speaker is Gregory Sholette. Gregory actually contributed an essay to the overall catalogue for We Make Our Own Histories, which was really intriguing and an incredible read. But Gregory is a New York-based artist, writist, teacher and activist. He's a professor at Queen's College in Cooney. He's co-director of social practice there, and he holds a PhD in history and memory studies from the University of Amsterdam. He's a graduate of the Whitney Independent Study Program in Critical Theory, and he's also an alumni of the Center for Advanced Study of Visual Arts. And his most recent book is The Art of Activism and the Activism of Art, which seems like a very appropriate place to start. Gregory, thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a sad time that brings us together, as it turns out, on a lot of levels, but I'm really honored, and people say this all the time, you're so honored, but I'm really honored to be here as a foreigner introducing this important conference and the work that's downstairs by Anthony. That's kind of unbelievable you would have me here, and I'll do my best to live up to it, but I think I'm here to learn as much as I am to provide any kind of insights, to be honest. But there's lots of people I want to thank, Helen Beaumont, of course, Helen Carey, too, who put me together with Anthony and the team, Jonathan and Melissa. And I'd really like to dedicate this to Alva Murphy, who was just such an inspiration. I've known her for many years, as I'm sure many of you have. I think her spirit of generosity and interrogation and interest as an artist really sort of speak to, you know, this coming together and these kind of questions that are being raised by this exhibition. So I'm going to call this Trouble in Museum Land. That was kind of a secondary title, if you don't mind. I'll read a little bit, show some images, and we can have a conversation. But to state the obvious, the world is in trouble, and so is the world of museums. From environmental activists crazy gluing themselves to constables and Degas and Picasso, as well as in most cases actually to the frames and the plexiglass covers of objects, of course, but to disgruntled staff workers organizing themselves into labor unions. This is particularly true in the United States, but I heard that the Vatican staff is about to organize perhaps as well. To workers calling for decolonizing museum collections, or even abolishing the very idea of the museum itself as a type of settler colonial institution. The situation seems to be unlike anything that has come before, but that's a question that I think we want to sort of interrogate, whether that's really true, or whether it's about a question of intensity. So one way or the other, one urgent question is really why? You know, why does this moment feel so absolutely intense? Why is there so much turmoil in institutions that really have for centuries been perceived as places of quiet retreat, right, and contemplation? At least that's the kind of image you have of what a museum is and it's supposed to be. It's a place where material culture, national, even civilizational culture and narratives are cared for, preserved, and studied. So is this really a time of truly unprecedented troubles? Significantly, perhaps, we might think that while everything that is in the museum raises these kind of questions, it is also back to the museum where we need to go, in many cases, to the archive, to have answers, if we're going to find answers. And I'd suggest that the exhibition that Anthony's put together is perhaps one of those areas, not only of questions, but of answers. So that's a kind of irony I think we need to be thinking about. I want to look at some of the forerunners of these questions this morning, not from the perspective of a museum worker or art or a historian in museums. I'm neither of those. I briefly had tenure at the New Museum in New York City and was actually fired the same year. It's a whole story we can talk about over the drinks later, but I will show something that I worked on there. Mostly my presence is really sort of as a bit of an outsider, one leg inside the art world very definitely, and another kind of in a world of activism, and you'll see that kind of play itself out with what I present. So we might want to also look at, in this case, the city itself as a kind of museum. And that's what I will be presenting because, as I said, I haven't worked in museums that often, but I'll be presenting something that I think that relates to this exhibition. Looking at New York City in this case, but it could also be Dublin, it could be many other places, as a kind of museum, right? As a kind of archive of layers and layers of history. And how does one trouble that kind of institutional structure? Naturally, there's a kind of Eurocentric position here, because this is what we're talking about, is the Eurocentric tradition of museums, etc. So what troubles the museum now, and how might it be different from the past? If there is a difference, and I'd say there is a difference of degree for sure, one likely answer involves looking at the profile of high culture at this moment, in the second decade of the 21st century. Of course, there has always been a link between collections of art, valuable artifacts, with the wealthiest and most powerful people, including clerics and nobility, politicians and businesses. But for a long time, these collections remained largely private, out of sight, except for those parts of the art that needed to be there to sort of teach people, right, about their subjugation, let's say, to the church or to the crown. What's quite clear today is the degree to which today's global glitterati revel in the high museum culture, particularly when it involves contemporary art. And that's the area that I come from, as does Anthony. Those whose fortunes exceed even the well-to-do of the last century have made a spectacle of expenditure and accumulation, one that is further amplified by events such as the Met Gala in New York City, which I don't go to, but we all see pictures of, and other sort of celebrations in which high fashion and art and money, of course, come together. So one reason why maybe these interventions are happening in a museum is because it's a place where that linkage is demonstrated so clearly in this particular part of history. And of course, all of this is further amplified by the superabundance of shared social media memes and posts and so on and so forth. So if we think of this as a kind of aesthetic aerosol of financialized capitalism, it's sort of an evanescent mist of value, and I use value here in the classical Marxist sense, that transforms certain art and artifacts into market assets, just as it does the lifestyles of those who can afford to leverage such unique cultural investments. Then we can sort of begin to see where this positioning is really very critical. According to the wealth management firm Morgan Stanley, quote, art indices do play an important and growing role in helping investors better understand the art market, end of quote. In other words, I'm sure all of you have portfolios that involve art here, and fine art. And this is becoming a very important area of investing, along with, of course, stocks and along with commodities and so on and so forth. It's a very different area of investing. It's interesting to see how that has happened, but you could actually own shares of very valuable artworks and put that in your portfolio. So we can see how the Occupy Wall Street anthem, "We Are the 99%, was really at odds with the unmistakable opulence associated with global high art culture and its spectacle. And by extension, so many world-class museums which are connected into it. So that may be why direct protest actions that we've been seeing take place inside museums. They strike two problems at once. Not only do they grab attention away from social media, which is not easy to do, even temporarily, from that endless flow, right? But they also underscore the troubling links between the ultra-wealthy, the ultra 1%, let's say, and the sphere of art and culture. But is this really the answer to why museums are so visibly perturbed today? Okay, it's part of the answer, but let's walk through an admittedly personalized and localized genealogy of the backstory, starting in 1960s New York, and that's what I'm going to be showing you with some images. Just give me a little bit more to frame this. We know that in the 20s and the 30s, and this is interesting because this is where Anthony's project really steps in, this question of who should be represented in a museum, what should be collected, what is the identity of people whose narrative belongs in a museum, was already underway, was already being troubled around issues of class in particular around the world. But we really go back to the 1960s and 70s, I think, to find some of the answers to this question around representation, around challenging the narrative. And we can, in my case, and I can only speak from where I'm coming from at this point, it was really, of course, the protests against the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 70s, which had ancillary effects across the culture. But that was the sort of focus. It had come, of course, from the New Left, out of Europe in particular, but also from SDS, Students for a Democratic Society in the United States. And liberation movements, the Black civil rights activists, Hispanic farm workers in the Southwest of the United States, feminists, Marxists, and what we today term the LGBTQ community, but also followed quickly by post-colonial criticism. All of these questionings of the master narrative were taking place. And I think most of you know all of this, but I'm just going to kind of put it out there so we know. We could say these are kind of a combined forces that directly question the museum and directly question the logic of the filters that had been applied to what were considered to be collectible, what was considered to be preservable, what was considered to be something that represented a particular profile. And now you have this kind of expanded or even exploded notion of a national identity, or identity in general, that had to be considered. But here's the twist. This is, I think, important. By the 1980s, something else is happening, something we call postmodernism. And the way I look at postmodernism, and there's a number of postmodernisms, we could discuss them, but the way I look at it is really from the critic and theorist Frederick Jameson. And he really thought, while postmodernism appeared to be very interested in history, all of a sudden you had many artworks that were sort of combining different kinds of artistic representations of the past. He really said it was about this sort of flushing of history, you might say, down the toilet, right? He said it was not about historically informed political agency, but it was about the erasure of it. And he talked about something called pastiche, and he used the idea of pastiche as a kind of schizophrenic play of historical and cultural signifiers that were uprooted from any connection to the memory or to narrative, right? I think that's the important part. Another phrase he uses is surrealism without the unconscious. So a play of images, a play of signifiers, and yet there doesn't seem to be any depth to it, doesn't seem to be connected to anything. I'm going to be showing you works that sort of oppose that position from the same period of time. And I think this is where some of this questioning that we are talking about today really starts to become more focused, particularly around this question of postmodernism in the 1980s, which of course coincides with the increasing financialization and neoliberalization of the economy. What does that mean? It means that the kind of relationship between labor and value is becoming more and more disrupted. And you have what Marx called fictional value, like money seemingly producing money. How does that happen? There doesn't seem to be a commodity of labor or anything in between. Strange particular moment that we are now completely saturated by. So I'm going to show you a few images. Just one more point I want to make. It was this time, and this is the late 80s and into the 90s, that the contemporary art world was confronted with its own political ethno-historical centrism. Now, again, I'm talking about New York, so bear with me, and I apologize for that. It was confronted with its own ethno-historical centrism as a rising tide of once excluded artists from outside the US, but also from outside Western Europe and the global North, were propelled by the dictates of an unprecedented globalization into the markets of the culture industry. So globalization has this kind of, incredible reaching effect. At the same time, it introduces the very same phenomena to all kinds of possibilities that maybe are not so compatible. So we think about someone like Hal Foster, the art critic Hal Foster, talking about the ethnographic turn in the art world. And I would say, looking at that, the ethnographic response to the loss of a certain established critical privilege, or a kind of white man's panic, also led to a series of turns, many turns, one after the other inside the world of contemporary art, as this kind of globalization and financialization really sort of become profound. And this coincides, though, with electronic forms of communication and memory enhancement that rejected the policing of the cultural archives. And we've seen this quite profoundly, right? The internet and its ability to sort of make connections to people and bring people out of the woodwork who hadn't been very visible. And that's not always been a good thing, certainly not in the United States. We've seen that. You could say, though, that a vast surplus of artistic producers, armed with the powerful means of self-representation, seem to be asking who gets to produce culture and history, for whom, and for why. So let me give you a few examples now of what I was talking about. If we can go, is there a way to click this forward, or you can do it back there? Okay, all right, so going back to the 1960s, the late 1960s, this is just a quick image of artists intervening in, this is the MoMA, not Spain, because you may remember that Guernica was in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City because Picasso refused to allow it to return to Spain until democracy returned. So these artists protesting the Vietnam War with posters entered in, interrupted the exhibition, and created this kind of spectacle inside. They were part of Art Workers Coalition, which was a group of artists in the late 1960s, early 70s, who were doing work around questioning the museum, beginning these kind of questions. Around the question of labor, for them in particular, but then it quickly spread to issues around the war, environmentalism, representation. For example, they said there should be a whole wing of the museum dedicated to people of color, particularly Black and people and Puerto Rican people, because there was a very active Puerto Rican activism at the time in New York with the Young Lords. So we'll go to the next slide. Artists began to question the museum in a really profound way, very different than what had happened in the 20s and 30s, where it was mostly focused around not having access and not having sort of being provided a sort of a wage, right, during that period of time. Here, it was about representation. And exhibitions like Harlem on My Mind, which was heavily criticized by the Black community in New York City. That's not what this is. This is the Whitney Museum at the time. But people asking the question, why aren't we sort of present in the museum? Women, people of color, and so forth. So we'll go to the next slide. Again, and this slide, just for a second, hold. This is the Young Lords, which was Puerto Rican, New Yorican organization in New York. And this is a demonstration. The poster you see at the top is the same one that was being held up inside the Museum of Modern Art, and babies from the Art Workers Coalition. So going back to this comment I started to make, this is the era of turmoil about the narrative, right, of high culture, about the narrative of cultural identity in the US. Next slide, please. My own professor, Hans Hacke's exhibition was supposed to take place at the Guggenheim Museum in 1971. It was canceled, complicated reasons, but basically it had to do with the work he was doing was, according to the director, an alien substance that was being let into the museum. He was literally talking about real estate holdings in New York City and in real time, and naming names and showing buildings that were really slumlord buildings, right? And this was considered something that was not acceptable within an art museum. So his show was canceled, followed by demonstrations in the Guggenheim. This is in the lobby atrium. And this is Yvonne Rainier and a group of artists from Art Workers Coalition. I think they did like a conga line down the steps after this, to protest what happened. So museums become, this is already 71, museums become a kind of focal point for a certain kind of protest intervention. Next slide, please. Bringing us very fast forward to just a few years ago, a group of artists that I've worked with called Gulf Labor Coalition, and we had many ancillaries, including the Illuminators, which is a group that runs around with a big truck and a projector. It's on a truck because it's illegal to do this, and they have to drive off sometimes very quickly, but you get the idea. And I'll explain why this was being projected this way. This is about 2018, maybe 2017. Next slide, please. So if you fly over to Abu Dhabi, well, I took this picture a long time ago now, but if you fly over to Abu Dhabi, there's an island off the edge of the city that was literally just a sandy, desert. And the authorities there, the kingdom, decided they were going to completely sort of terraform this island, like true science fiction story, turn it into an oasis, right? So this actually says the Island of Happiness, which is perhaps for people that the ultra-wealthy who might live there, who will be able to go to NYU, who has a station there. They'll be able to go to the Louvre. They'll be able to go to the Guggenheim, but not for the workers building this fantastic utopia. Next slide, please. Workers were promised all kinds of wonderful sort of accommodations, wages, and they were drawn from countries in the global south primarily, from the Philippines to Egypt to Bangladesh to India and so on and so forth, with the idea that, okay, we'll go there and then we'll be able to send money back to our families. And they arrived and discovered that conditions were very bad. They couldn't organize, and that the money they thought they were going to send back had to be paid back for the visa that they got. So they were almost like indentured servants. You can never become a citizen in this part of the world, in the kingdoms of UAE. So a group of artists and activists decided we should be talking about these workers because this museum, these museums, especially the Guggenheim, focuses on contemporary art. And if they're going to build a contemporary Guggenheim, that should be done with the kind of expectations we would have in Europe or the United States and so forth, labor conditions. Good. Next. This is an artist's sketch. I have to say that those pictures now actually reveal exactly this. I don't know if anybody has been there. I've not been back. In fact, I'm probably on a list of people who are banned from going there. But this is a Frank Gehry, a museum. And it was the biggest, will be the biggest in the world. The Louvre is already built. This sketch came from before. So we started protesting this. Next slide, please. By doing things like this inside, again, the Guggenheim. So all the way back, 71 protests, all the way forward. This is 2017, 2018, May Day, flyers coming down from above. And next slide, banners that we smuggled into the museum to create a splash saying, respect workers' rights. The museum becomes a focal point for increasing agitation, intervention, and focus on things that are not necessarily about art, but are about other kinds of rights, right? Heteronymous to art. Next slide, please. Also, Liberate Tate in London, who succeeded, even though the museum will never admit, in having BP, British Petroleum, excised from the financial backers of the institution after many, many interventions like this one that took place inside the museum itself. Next slide, please. A little bit more recently, Occupy Wall Street. This is Occupy Museums, an offshoot of Occupy Wall Street in New York City. And you can see this is an exhibition of Diego Rivera's work. Diego Rivera was one of the first, if not the first, artist to have a solo exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. And of course, he's famously a communist, promoter of working class, but also sort of indigenous cultures in the South. So it's quite interesting. They were doing an exhibition. This is 2015, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe even 2011. And Occupy Museums went in and did one of their general meetings and called people together to talk about what does it mean to be in a museum like this? What does it mean for them to have Diego Rivera's work in a museum like this at a time when the 1% seemed to be dominating everything? Next slide, please. And more recently, Warren Kanders, who was a trustee of the Whitney Museum of Art, he also happened to be a manufacturer, a company, believe it or not, called Safariland, of so-called non-sort of lethal weapons, which includes tear gas, includes rubber bullets, and these were being provided to the military on the border with South America and Central America and Mexico in the US, but also in Palestine at the time. So people said, we should have this person off the board. Now, what's interesting is that the members of the museum staff had initially started this protest by writing a letter, 100 of them, to the boards of directors and saying, we want this person off the board. That's really unheard of. I'm sure it's unheard of anywhere, but certainly in the United States. Curators, staff people, that's a big risk. They have no union at the time. They do now, which is part of the story here. But they had no union and no protection, so they could easily have been fired. So you had this pressure from inside, and then pressure came from outside with various groups coming together to call for the decolonization of the museum. Can you see the next slide? And I took this picture during a demonstration in the lobby of the museum. Sage was burned to recognize indigenous people in the United States. And this demonstration took place like every week for months until finally Candors agreed to step down off of the board. Next slide. The fire department was also called. I think this would have just gone on forever, except the fire department came and had to come in and secure this device, whatever it was, a pot of burning sage. So, next slide, please. This takes place just about the same time in the United States that museums begin to sort of organize, the staff members begin to organize into unions, including New Museum, where I worked years before, and other museums. Ironically, New Museum, which is often considered this very progressive alternative to the mainstream museums, founded by Marcia Tucker, a very interesting, dynamic person. New Museum decided to hire a firm to try to stop the union from organizing. And so that's almost certainly what this sign relates to. Next slide, please. But we had, from the New Museum, which did finally get a union vote passed, even though they pushed back, the museum tried to push back. We have museums then, museum unions organizing around the country. This is Philadelphia. If we go to the next slide, also Philadelphia, the city of my birth. In the next slide. And then you have people like Mazala Diabanza, who goes into museums, he's Congolese, and literally tries to extract objects from exhibitions that have these works in them in various places. This is in the Netherlands, but he also did it in France before this. And he's not really trying to steal the work, because obviously you wouldn't do that in broad daylight, I don't think. But he intends to get confronted and stopped, and therefore create, obviously, a media spectacle. So he goes in, picks up an artwork, talks about how this was taken by, from the people of another country. And sometimes it's a Congolese work, sometimes it's other works from Africa, sub-Saharan Africa in particular. And then, of course, he's confronted maybe by a gendarme or maybe by just a worker in the museum. Is he an art activist? Is this a performance? Is he an activist playing the role of a performer? I mean, these areas have become so sort of completely blurred. It's really sort of fascinating and interesting to see what happens. Next slide, please. And more recently, these are images of people holding their dead children in Gaza that were dropped, again, illegally, just as a guerrilla action inside the Guggenheim, once again. The Guggenheim in the future may be known as like the most important place for demonstrations of this type, and rather than for the collection that it has. It's a possibility. Next slide, please. And not that long ago, Brooklyn Museum, this is just sort of sums up a lot of this, right? Which is to say the museums themselves are a point of this kind of colonial, Eurocentric thinking. How do we decolonize it? Can it be decolonized? I think this is one of the questions that I'm sure we'll be talking about. Can you decolonize the museum without eliminating the museum? I mean, that's a tricky question. Next slide, please. Just to say that this isn't all that absolutely new. Aspects of it are certainly, but we could go all the way back to the Paris Commune for sure, 1781. Next slide, when Gustave Courbet, the famous realist painter, you see his image, was part of a group of men who basically toppled the Vendôme column in Paris, a monument to Napoleon, a monument to war, and they just tore it down. This was a committee that was there to protect art, but this particular work that they wanted to sort of demolish, and they did do that. And of course, paid the price in terrible ways with the Bloody Week that took place not long after. Comrade Courbet survives, but he has to flee the country, and he's forced to pay to have the column rebuilt. So the irony of history, I mean, is just sort of profound. He died without ever paying, but he never went back to France either. Next slide, please. Or the work of Hans Haacke, who I mentioned before, the professor I had. I remember when he was actually having this work fabricated at the Cooper Union when I was a student in the 1980s. But here the work takes the capstone or a sort of variation from the Metropolitan Museum in New York, the kind of banners that fly outside to talk about the collection. And if you look at it, instead of having, Arts of Africa and sort of a celebratory quote, it's really Mobil Oil Corporation, because they had been paying for this exhibition. And you can see something behind it as well. And that you can only do that if you're in the space. You walk around, and then from the side, you can actually see a photograph of children who are dead from Soweto uprising in South Africa. I'm sure you know the story there during the fight against apartheid. I think it's very interesting, too, and I would say maybe this is a conversation we have with Anthony and others, that this kind of engagement, this kind of physical engagement with the display technology of the museum, but to tell a different narrative than the one is expected. I see that very much going on in Anthony's work downstairs. Next slide, please. Again, Hans Haughey, public work in Graz, Austria, during an exhibition called Points of Reference. And Points of Reference was 1988. The Werner Fens, the curator, said, you know, this is a place in Graz, Austria, where the Nazis had significant activities, architectural structures built, and so on and so forth. But there's no marking for that, 1988. Nobody knows that this park was like where the Hitler Youth got together and, you know, hadn't had their celebrations and so forth. So he turned it over to artists to temporarily mark locations used by the Nazis. Haughey rebuilt this structure, which had been there in the 1920s, and neo-Nazis in 1988 blew it up, and that became what you see here, another aspect of his work. Next slide, please. What I want to point to is that, if I'm talking about the 1980s as this kind of postmodernism, the pushback maybe starts in the 1990s, at least in the US context. Here, Haughey v. Edgar Hipperbergs does projects with these very understated signs talking about the native indigenous people who would have been actually located in these areas, and saying, you know, this is brought to you by this tribe, right, in a kind of interesting way. He himself is a native artist. So this is 1988, again, this period of time when people are beginning to ask questions about the representation of history in a way I think that hadn't happened before. Okay, next slide, please. Alan Michelson, who was also a member of the collective I'll speak about in a minute, REPOhistory. This is downtown, right across from City Hall in New York. There was a pond there, a very famous pond called Collect Pond. It was very important to the Lenape people that lived there. It was also important to the early European settlers. And it's completely buried now, as you can see, under concrete. So he sort of created a representation of its shoreline just to bring it back. 1990, next slide, please. Fred Wilson, whose name has already come up in our tour before. Fred was invited by not an art museum, but the Maryland Historical Society, which was, you know, a museum in the city of Maryland, in the city of Baltimore, I should say. Mostly people, white people would go there. They would be reaffirmed about sort of the colonial history of the United States. But they had interesting holdings that weren't like on display. And Fred basically went through all of their material and was able to actually bring these things out and put them on display. So it has to be narrated. What you see here, of course, is, you know, the classic Paul Revere or something like that. Silversmithing, very important to the American Revolution. But you also have slave shackles sitting right there in the front, metalwork of another kind. Remember, these slave shackles were in the collection, but not on display. So he's not only brought them out, but he's juxtaposed them, right, with display. On the right, if we do the next slide, I think I've got, yeah. On the right, you see a perambulator, but when you look inside, you see a hat from a Ku Klux Klan member, right? Again, part of the collection that was not seen. So Fred's Mining the Museum becomes a real important touchstone, I think, for this shift that we're talking about throughout the 90s, now really into the 90s in a very important way. Next slide. Other projects went on. The year after, Renata Stee and Frieda Schnock do this Places of Remembrance, which was about the anti-Jewish laws in Germany, right, in the 1930s. And 33, he's got some going up to 1942. Some of them they actually made up, but some of them are actual laws that were, passed by the Nazis. And it's things like, you know, Jews shall not have cats, or Jews shall not play music, or Jews cannot buy this kind of bread, and so on and so forth. And they just put this up in the Schönberg district of Berlin. And people were like looking at these, of course, and startled and shocked and having to sort of relive a memory that they didn't really want to experience again. Next slide. This artist, Luther Baumgarten, also back to the Guggenheim, putting the names of indigenous tribes inside the museum. It's a work that I don't think people have really, excuse me, this is 1993, not 1093. This work that people don't talk about so much anymore, but it's quite interesting that he was doing this as early as 93. Next slide. This is an exhibition. I said that I had a very brief stint at New Museum that I did with my team in the educational department of the museum. We had ongoing work where artists would go into classrooms and work with young people, not to make art or not to become sort of better at understanding art. This was not art appreciation, but to work with artists to create curricula around other kinds of topics. In this case, American history, or identity of various cultures and so forth. It was a really interesting alternative to the classic version of education in a museum. And again, Marcia Tucker, and I keep thinking of Marcia now in relationship to Alvey, so there's a sort of strange correspondence in my mind. But Marcia was very sort of innovative, very willing to push sort of the barriers of what a museum was. For example, she had an exhibition where the public came in and the tags on the wall, they got to write the labels for the works. She would experiment with the idea of the exhibition itself quite frequently. So the education program at the museum was also quite unusual and radical, and we did an installation by the students who had worked with artists called Whose History Is It Anyway? And the next slide, please. And we had all kinds of things with the students speaking about their own cultural background. You could try on clothes that were made from various cultural traditions of the students, and so on and so forth. 1998. So I guess what I'm trying to frame here is this questioning has been going on for a while, and it's been building in its impact. And I'll show you one other project, if we could go on from here, and one more. And this is a project that we did in public space, coming back to this idea of New York City as a kind of museum, but questioning the museum. Stuart Davis, some of you who maybe know contemporary art, he was a well-known painter in the 1920s and 30s into the 50s, not so well-known today. His loft, his studio space, happened to be in this building. It's a privately owned building right off 14th Street. The owners decided to put a plaque up. This is not an official historical plaque. But what's quite interesting is it talks about how he was inspired by jazz and so forth. What it doesn't say is that he was a very important theorist of the Communist Party USA. And there's so much history missing, right, in the streets of a place like New York City. So thinking about the 1988 Points of Reference project in Graz, which I showed you before, we created a project called REPOhistory. And the idea of we're repossessing history, although the actual name came from a movie, next slide please, which hopefully you've all seen. And if you haven't, that's your homework. You have to watch this movie. But the idea that we were going to repossess histories and put them back in public space. So as opposed to stealing them back for a company, we were doing it for the public. Next slide. Next slide, please. Everything was collected on this map, the first project, in 1992. The year was significant. If you think about it a second, it was the quincentennial of Columbus coming to the New World, right? Supposedly discovering the New World, right? But really beginning the invasion of the New World. And all of those little red dots correspond there, and those are sites of various signs, each created by a different group of artists or individual artists, all in Lower Manhattan, because that, of course, is where the most layers of history could be sort of cited, from indigenous people on through to the Dutch, to the English, and so on and so forth. Next. And this is the kind of thing that we put up. For 1 year, we just had temporary permission to do this. So for 1 year, we put these signs up in the street, very simple metal signs, images usually on one side, text on the other, And this was where the first meal and slave market was located, right near actually where the stock exchange got its start on Wall Street. Interestingly, in the last mayoral administration under de Blasio, they put a permanent sign here. Again, this was temporary and came down 1993. They put a permanent sign up for the slave market, finally. There's been one, of course, for the stock exchange forever. But no one knew about this project. And so I was like writing in and saying, you know, you're actually not the first people to do this. We did this briefly. But it's very interesting, like, things get just layered over so fast in a place like New York, especially. The forgetting is as intense as the remembering sometimes. Next slide. Back of the sign, just to give you an idea what it looked like. We soon realized we had way too much text for people to read. Next slide. Again, Alan Michelson, who did the Collect Pond piece, talking about John Astor, Jacob Astor, who was basically trading with Native American people, but you may know the story that I'm not sure how much Astor was involved in this, but the sort of effort to get rid of indigenous people included contaminating blankets, and the image here is the Hudson Bay blanket, the color pattern, contaminating them with smallpox, which the native population had no defense against, and literally carrying out germ warfare. But he made his fortune, and he has, you know, a prominent place in New York City architecturally, and Alan did this piece about him. Next slide. A man who literally just died in the street. He actually died in Washington, D.C., but he used to live downtown near Wall Street, near the stock exchange. And his family gave the two artists who made this sign a picture of him so they could create just this temporary memorial to this individual. Next slide. Where bodies go to be buried when they have, you know, no identification or minimal sort of means. Potter's Field on Ellis Island. This is right where you get the ferry to go to Ellis Island, of course, the gateway to the country. Jane's own aunt was coming in from Italy to the United States. She never got off Ellis Island. She was considered unfit, and she spent the rest of her life there and died. So Jane did this piece. You may have remembered during COVID, this same location was used to bury bodies of people who had died of COVID without the means of being buried. Next slide. This one is really very profound because the man at the top basically led to the death of the woman at the bottom. The woman at the bottom is known as Madame Restell, and she was a very, very successful abortionist in New York City in the 19th century, located right here, and you may be dawning on you what that location is. I'll explain it in a minute if you don't. She had a sort of mansion there. She was very successful. Anthony Comstock's name has been coming up again and again in the sort of pushback against abortion rights in the United States because he came up with a law, the Comstock Law. He was not a politician, but anything that you mailed through the U.S. mail that had to do with abortificants or birth control could be considered pornography. She was prosecuted under this law. She went to prison, and then she killed herself. She committed suicide. This sign was blown up when the World Trade Center was initially blown up. You can see it on the side here to your right, just the edge of the building. The first attempt, if you remember, was 1993 when a van blew up in the basement. We also lost a really brilliant young artist in the building when it was attacked again in 2001. Next slide. And this work, Advantages of an Unregulated Free Market Economy. I don't have to tell you where this is located. You can probably guess. The next slide, please. Right outside the stock exchange, which happened to be having its 200th anniversary. You can see these banners flying. They were very upset, and they called the people that gave us the permits and said, you have to take this sign down outside. And it was kind of wonderful. The person that was involved at the Department of Transportation basically said, no, they have a permit. They get to keep it up for as long as the permit runs. What we figured out later was this person, this individual, was definitely part of a sort of old left, maybe Communist Party type individuals who had gotten into the government. Under Giuliani, under Rudolph Giuliani, they were basically shown the door. Next slide. And this is a project that came under Giuliani's administration and basically was the last thing we got to do because he really clamped down, not permitting us to put the signs up initially, and then finally we forced it through a lawsuit and did it. But this is a work, David Thorne, Jenny Pollock, and you can read it. It says from 1994-96, 75 people were killed, shot in back, shot in head, pinned face down, shot, choked, hogtied, and crushed, beaten to death by New York City police officers, and only 3 officers were convicted of committing any crime, 0 for murder. This is 1998. Obviously, a lot has happened since then, a lot of water under the bridge, but this project took place and really upset the administration. That is Anthony Baez, the graph mural on the wall. We didn't create that was there, because he was playing touch football in the street. When an off-duty cop came by, the ball bounced off the man's car. He got out, put him in a chokehold, illegal chokehold, and he died. And then they claimed he had cocaine in his body, and of course that was not the case. And that's his mother looking out. So we were able to put the signs up near where several of these murders took place. Next. Or Brenda Burden, one of the first woman to become a New York City fire department officer under extremely difficult circumstances that were leading up to it and even after she became assigned. So work by Susan Shupley in the street for her. Interestingly, Berkman has since become an artist, if you look her up. Next slide, please. And we got in trouble more than a few times also with these signs. This is in the Spanish newspaper talking about one of them that was quite controversial about housing quotas between white people and black people. Next slide. And I think I'm pretty much going to wrap it here so we can get on with the rest of the conference and talk. But just to say again, this point of tension with the museum and the museum culture, I think, is extremely important. And I think it's very much germane to what Anthony has done downstairs. I know some of you already got to see the presentation that he made, and hopefully everyone will get a chance to do that. But I want to just wrap up by citing him a little bit. Haughey has said that, we are raw material, right? We are a raw material of history. He insists that we are not outside history, we are not dislocated from history. We have more power than we like to think. And this, of course, leads to this title that comes from Karl Marx. People make their own history, we make their own history, but of course we don't make it just as we please, and that's the rest of the quote that Marx put, because he realized that there are limitations, material and real limitations to that. So while we do make our own history, we don't always get to do it just as we choose. And the obstinacy of histories and institutions, of objects and materials and narratives clearly cuts both ways. If part of the trouble of today comes from the cultural sector, from the sector and museums, then maybe so do the answers. And I would say that Anthony's work begins to sort of bring one of those answers out into visibility. And I'm sure this conference today is going to have a lot of discussion around exactly those ideas. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.